I am 70 years old now. Most mornings, I sit by the window of my small house in Sacramento, California, watching the light move slowly across the street. The world outside feels louder than it used to, faster, more impatient. When you reach this age, people often ask you questions like, "Are you proud of your life? Would you do it all again?" They think the answers come quickly. They don't, because before I was a husband, before I was a worker, before I was a father, I was just a quiet boy, trying to understand why life already felt so heavy. I was born in the early 1950s, in a small working-class neighborhood on the edge of town. The houses all looked the same: low roofs, thin walls, small yards with dry grass. You could tell what kind of people lived there by the sound of the doors. Our door never slammed. It closed gently, like we were afraid of making noise. My father worked with his hands. My mother worked with her worry. No one talked about dreams in our house. We talked about bills, weather, and getting through the week. That was the environment I grew up in. Not violent, not cruel, just quietly exhausting. As a child, I learned something very early. Don't take up space. When adults talked, I stayed silent. When guests came over, I stayed in my room. When something broke, I pretended I hadn't touched it. Not because I was well behaved, but because attention felt dangerous. I noticed how tired my parents were, how their faces changed when money came up. So I learned to become easy. Easy children survive better in hard homes. We were never starving, but we were always close. Some nights, dinner was simple enough that you didn't ask for seconds. Other nights, my mother would say, "This is enough," even when it didn't feel like it was. I remember lying in bed, listening to my stomach, trying to fall asleep before it reminded me again that food was not guaranteed. That kind of hunger doesn't scream, it waits. The first time I felt shame, I didn't have a word for it yet. I only remember the feeling. It happened when I was about 8 years old. A boy from school came over to play. He looked around our house, the old furniture, the quiet rooms, and asked, "Why is it so dark in here?" I didn't answer. After he left, I sat alone and wondered what else people noticed about us. From that day on, I started comparing. And comparison is where shame grows. People sometimes think unhappy childhoods must be full of yelling or violence. Mine wasn't. It was full of responsibility I didn't yet understand. I worried about things a child shouldn't worry about. Money, stress, whether tomorrow would feel easier. That's how childhood ended for me. Not suddenly, but slowly. Now at 70, I don't blame my parents. They did what they could with what they had. But I do recognize something important. That quiet beginning shaped the way I lived my entire life. It taught me to endure, to stay, to accept less. And endurance, while admirable, can quietly steal your joy if you're not careful. I didn't know it then. But everything that came later, school, work, love, loss, was built on that early lesson. Stay quiet. Don't ask. Be grateful for whatever you get. In the next part of my life, school would teach me something else, that even when you try to hide, the world has a way of reminding you where you stand. When people ask me where I'm from, I usually name the city. But the truth is, I'm not really from Sacramento. I'm from a house, a small, tired house, where worry lived quietly in every room. Our house sat at the end of a narrow street, not far from the railroad tracks. Every night, when the trains passed, the walls would tremble just a little. Not enough to scare you, just enough to remind you that nothing around us was permanent. The paint on the walls had faded to a color that once tried to be white. The floors creaked because they were older than their owners. We didn't decorate much, not because we didn't care, but because decoration felt like a luxury meant for other people. My parents never sat me down to talk about money. They didn't have to. Money spoke for itself. It spoke late at night. Through whispered conversations they thought I couldn't hear. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to words like rent, late, and next month. I didn't understand the numbers, but I understood the tone. Fear has a sound, and once you recognize it, you never forget it. In our house, nothing was ever thrown away too quickly. Food scraps were saved. Clothes were repaired. Broken things were used a little longer. I remember my father fixing the same chair over and over again. Each time it broke, he tightened the screws, shook it once, and said, "It'll hold." That chair became a symbol of our life, always holding, never quite comfortable. My mother rarely complained. That was her strength and her burden. She woke up before the sun, moved quietly through the house, and made sure everything was ready before anyone noticed she had been there. Some afternoons, I'd find her sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, staring at nothing. I didn't interrupt. I sensed that her silence was holding something heavy. Years later, I realized she wasn't resting. She was calculating. We didn't have dramatic moments where everything fell apart. Our life was made of small pressures that never left. Bills that arrived on time, paychecks that didn't. We lived carefully. Careful with money. Careful with words. Careful with expectations. Carefulness became our culture. Across the street lived a family who seemed lighter. Their windows were brighter at night, their laughter louder. I used to sit by our window and watch them eat dinner together, not because I wanted their food, but because they looked relaxed. I wondered what it felt like to live without constantly checking what might go wrong next. That question stayed with me long after childhood. Living like that teaches you lessons no one ever explains out loud. I learned that safety mattered more than joy, that stability was worth sacrifice, that wanting too much was dangerous. I didn't learn how to dream. I learned how to settle. And at the time, that felt like wisdom. Now, when I think about that house, I don't feel anger. I feel understanding. My parents were not weak people. They were exhausted people. They carried responsibility without ever putting it down. But I also see something else now. That house taught me to accept less than I deserved. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I didn't believe more was meant for me. Home taught me how to survive quietly. School would teach me something harder, that no matter how careful you are, the world has a way of ranking people and letting you know exactly where you stand. That lesson began the first time I stood in a lunch line with nothing in my hands. School was the first place where I understood that the world keeps score, not with words, not with rules, but with looks, silence, and the things you don't have. Every morning, I walked to school alone. The streets were quiet that early, the air still cool, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. I liked that walk. It was the only part of the day where no one expected anything from me. By the time I reached the school building, I already felt tired. Not from the distance, but from preparing myself to be seen. Lunchtime came every day, whether I was ready or not. Other kids lined up, coins and paper bags in their hands. I stood there too, empty. At first I tried pretending I forgot my lunch, pretending I wasn't hungry. Eventually I learned a better solution. I walked outside. Behind the school there was a water tap near the wall. I drank slowly, as if that could fill me. I waited until the bell rang. No one ever asked where I went. That hurt more than the hunger. In class I sat near the back, not because the teacher told me to, but because it felt safer. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't volunteer to read aloud. I learned how to disappear in a room full of people. Teachers described me as quiet and well-behaved. What they meant was easy to ignore, and being ignored felt better than being noticed for the wrong reasons. One afternoon, a classmate invited me to his birthday party. I went home and asked my mother what I should bring. She paused. Then she said, "We'll see." We didn't go. That day, I learned something important. Some invitations aren't meant to be accepted. They're meant to remind you where you belong. I never asked again. They taught us math and history, but school also taught us hierarchy. Who wore new shoes, who brought lunch every day, who spoke confidently, and who stayed quiet. I learned that intelligence didn't matter as much as confidence. And confidence, I noticed, often came from having enough. Once, during a group project, we were asked to bring supplies from home. Everyone showed up prepared. I didn't. The teacher looked at me, not angry, just disappointed. That look stayed with me longer than any punishment ever could. Shame has a long memory. It remembers everything. By the time I reached my teenage years, I had already decided something. I would never stand out. Not in class, not at work, not in life. Standing out was dangerous. Blending in felt safer. So I stopped asking questions. Stopped imagining alternatives. Stopped believing life could be different. I became good at adapting, not at choosing. Now, at 70, I understand what I didn't then. School didn't make me small. It simply revealed how small I already felt. But I also see this clearly now. That boy wasn't weak. He was observant, sensitive, careful. He learned how to read rooms, how to survive quietly. Those skills helped me later in life, but they also cost me something. They cost me my voice. When school finally ended, I didn't feel relief. I felt uncertainty because the structure was gone, and all that remained was the question, now what? Adulthood waited ahead, and I stepped into it with the same lesson I had learned years ago. Don't expect too much. Don't risk too much. Don't want too much. That mindset would guide my next choices, for better and for worse. Leaving school didn't mean leaving insecurity behind. It meant carrying it forward into adulthood. In the next part of my life, I would learn how easy it is to confuse survival with success, and how quietly dreams can disappear when no one is watching. When school ended, no one handed me a map. There was no moment where adulthood announced itself. One day, I was a boy trying not to stand out. The next, I was expected to know how to live. I finished school quietly. No celebration, no big plans, just a sense that something had ended. And something heavier had begun. People asked me what I wanted to do next. I didn't know how to answer. Wanting felt like a luxury I hadn't learned to afford. So instead of asking myself what I wanted, I asked a different question. What is the safest choice? That question would follow me for decades. My first real job wasn't something I dreamed of. It was something available. A local warehouse, not far from the river. The building smelled like dust and oil. The work was repetitive. The hours were long, but the paycheck was steady. I remember holding that first check, feeling relief more than pride. Relief meant survival. Pride felt unnecessary. Being young didn't feel exciting. It felt serious. I watched older men come to work every day. Their movements slow but familiar, as if they had accepted something long ago. They talked about weather, sports, and how fast time moved. No one talked about dreams. That's when I understood. Adulthood wasn't about becoming someone. It was about becoming reliable, and reliability was praised more than happiness. There was something I never told anyone. I liked writing. Nothing special. Just thoughts, small stories, observations. Sometimes, late at night, I wrote in a notebook I kept hidden in a drawer. I never imagined showing it to anyone. Dreams, when you're poor, feel embarrassing. So I kept that part of myself quiet. Eventually, I stopped writing. Not because I lost interest, but because life got louder. As years passed, friends slowly disappeared. Not through arguments, but through schedules. Some got married. Some moved away. Some stayed exactly where they were. We didn't say goodbye. We just stopped calling. That's how adulthood works. You don't lose people suddenly. You lose them gradually. In my early 20s, I started noticing something uncomfortable. Other people seemed to move forward. New jobs, new apartments, new confidence. I stayed where I was, not because I lacked ability, but because change felt risky. I had seen what instability did to my parents. I told myself I was being smart, but underneath that logic was fear. Fear of failing, fear of wanting too much, fear of ending up with nothing. One afternoon, my supervisor asked if I wanted more responsibility. It meant longer hours, more pressure, but also a future. I said yes without hesitation. That was the moment I quietly chose my path. Not because it excited me, but because it promised stability. I told myself, this is how life works. And for a long time, I believed it. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had become someone others could depend on. Reliable, calm, predictable. People trusted me, but I didn't quite know myself. I had built an identity around responsibility, not around meaning. And while that kept me safe, it also kept me distant from my own desires. Now, at 70, I don't judge that younger version of me harshly. He did what he knew. He chose safety because safety had always been missing. But I also recognize the cost. Every time you choose safety over honesty, a small part of you goes quiet. Not gone, just quieter. And over time, those quiet parts add up. It was during those years, when I was steady but unsure, reliable but incomplete, that love entered my life. Not like a rescue, not like a miracle, but like a question I wasn't sure how to answer. In the next part of my life, I would learn that loving someone is easy. Knowing how to be present is not. Love didn't arrive in my life like it does in movies. There were no dramatic moments. No music playing in the background. It came quietly, almost shyly, the way most important things do. And at the time, I didn't even recognize it for what it was. I met her through ordinary circumstances. A mutual friend, a casual gathering, nothing special. She had a calm presence, the kind that didn't demand attention, but slowly held it. When she smiled, it wasn't wide or loud. It was patient. That made me feel safe, and safety was something I understood. When we started talking, I kept my words measured. I listened more than I spoke. I had learned long ago that revealing too much of yourself can be dangerous. So I asked about her life, her family, her plans. She asked about mine too. I answered, but carefully. I never spoke about my fears, my doubts, the parts of me that felt unfinished. I didn't want to be a burden. No one taught me how to date. My parents didn't talk about love. They talked about responsibility. So when we spent time together, I focused on being dependable. I showed up on time, paid when I could, listened politely. I thought that was love. I didn't know that love also requires vulnerability. Our first real disagreement was small, something trivial. I don't even remember what it was about. What I remember is how uncomfortable it made me. Conflict felt like danger. I went quiet, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to argue without feeling like everything might collapse. She noticed. She asked, "Why won't you talk?" I didn't have an answer. As time passed, I began to notice something strange. She knew my routines, my schedule, my responsibilities, but she didn't really know me. And if I'm honest, I wasn't sure I knew her either. We were two careful people walking alongside each other, afraid to step too close. At the time, I thought that meant maturity. Now I know it meant caution. There were evenings when she sat beside me, and I still felt alone. Not because she wasn't present, but because I wasn't. My mind was often elsewhere, thinking about work, bills, the future. I was physically there, but emotionally guarded. She once said, "You're hard to reach." That sentence stayed with me. When I decided to propose, it wasn't impulsive. It was logical. We had been together long enough. We were stable. We got along. Marriage felt like the next responsible step. I asked her quietly. No grand gestures. She said yes, not with excitement, but with certainty. At the time, that felt right. Now, from where I sit at 70, I understand something I didn't then. I didn't choose her because she completed me. I chose her because she didn't threaten me. That doesn't mean there was no love. There was, but it was a cautious love. A careful love, the kind that doesn't break easily, but also doesn't burn very brightly. Love exposed a flaw I didn't know I had. I knew how to survive. I knew how to be reliable, but I didn't know how to be emotionally present. And that would matter later, much later, in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Marriage didn't change me overnight. It didn't solve my uncertainty or teach me how to open up. Instead, it magnified everything I hadn't learned yet. In the next part of my life, I would learn that commitment can hold two people together, but it cannot replace communication. Marriage didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a continuation, the same life, just with another person sharing the space. At first, everything seemed fine. We moved into a modest apartment not far from where I worked. Nothing fancy, second-hand furniture, plain curtains, quiet evenings. We told ourselves this was what adulthood looked like. Stable, predictable, manageable, and for a while, that was enough. Marriage, I learned, is built from routines. Who wakes up first? Who makes coffee? Who locks the door at night? We learned each other's habits quickly. What we didn't learn was how to talk when something felt wrong. If something bothered me, I stayed quiet. If something bothered her, she hesitated. Silence became our shared language. As months turned into years, responsibility filled the space where curiosity used to live. Work demanded more of me. Bills arrived regularly. The future felt heavier. I focused on providing. That felt like love. I believed that if I worked hard enough, everything else would take care of itself. I was wrong. We didn't fight loudly. We disagreed quietly. Conversations ended early. Issues were postponed. Feelings were minimized. We told ourselves we were being mature. But unresolved emotions don't disappear. They settle. And over time, they create distance that feels normal because it grows slowly. There's a kind of loneliness that only exists when someone is always there. We ate dinner together most nights, sometimes in silence, sometimes with small talk, rarely with depth. I noticed she stopped sharing her worries. I stopped asking, not because we didn't care, but because caring required energy we didn't know how to give anymore. One night, she asked me a simple question. "Are you happy?" I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't hear her, but because I didn't know. Happiness wasn't something I had learned to measure. I finally said, "I think so." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. Marriage made me more serious, more focused, more controlled. I became good at managing life, but worse at living it. I learned how to fix problems without addressing feelings. That skill served me well in the outside world. Inside the marriage, it created a quiet gap that neither of us knew how to close. Now, with time behind me, I see marriage differently. It wasn't that we were incompatible. It was that we were unprepared. Unprepared to be vulnerable. Unprepared to admit fear. Unprepared to ask for more without feeling guilty. We brought our past into the marriage and never really unpacked it. Eventually, life moved us forward whether we were ready or not. Work opportunities came. Responsibilities increased. And then, one day, another question entered our lives. A bigger one that would change everything. Children. Before becoming parents, I threw myself deeper into work. I told myself I was preparing, but really, I was hiding. In the next part of my life, I would learn how easy it is to mistake productivity for purpose. Work didn't just become part of my life. It became my identity. When responsibilities grew, so did my sense of purpose. Providing felt like proof that I mattered, that I was doing something right. I didn't question it. Men of my generation weren't taught to ask why, only how much more we could carry. My days started early and ended late. I told myself I was doing it for my family, and in many ways, that was true. But what I didn't realize was what I was trading. I came home tired, not just physically, emotionally. There wasn't much left to give. Work gave me structure, clear expectations, clear results. Life at home was messier, unspoken feelings, unanswered questions. So I stayed longer at work, volunteered for overtime, took on extra responsibility. I called it dedication. Looking back, it was avoidance. My supervisors noticed. They praised my reliability, my consistency. "You're solid," they said. That word stuck with me. Solid. It sounded like something to be proud of. But solid things don't bend. They don't adapt easily. And over time, that became a problem. I paid the bills on time. We never went hungry. We had what we needed. But presence isn't something you can compensate for later. I missed conversations, missed moments, missed the subtle shifts happening at home. I told myself there would be time later. There always is. Until there isn't. One night, I came home later than usual. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I ate alone without thinking much of it. Years later, that memory returned to me with a strange weight, because I couldn't remember where everyone was. That absence had become normal. Being reliable earned me respect, but it also isolated me. People came to me with problems, not with feelings. At home, I became more of a function than a person. The one who handled things, fixed things, solved things, but didn't talk about them. At 70, I see the pattern clearly. I believed my worth was tied to how useful I was. That belief came from childhood, from watching my parents struggle, from fearing instability. Work became my shield, and like all shields, it protected me and kept others at a distance. I thought I was in control of my career, of my responsibilities. I didn't see how fragile it all was, because when you build your life around one thing, you're vulnerable to losing everything when that thing disappears. I would learn that later, much later. Somewhere during those years, children entered our lives. Quietly at first, then completely. They changed the rhythm of our home, but I was slow to change myself. In the next part of my life, I would learn that love doesn't just need to be provided. It needs to be shown. When my children were born, something inside me shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to remind me that my life was no longer only mine. I remember holding my first child in my arms. So small, so quiet. I felt fear before joy. Fear of doing something wrong. Fear of not being enough. No one talks about that part of parenthood. They talk about love, but not about the weight that comes with it. I loved my children. That much is true. But I loved them the way I knew how. By working harder. By worrying silently. By making sure nothing went wrong. I thought safety was the greatest gift I could give. I didn't realize they needed something else too. I attended school events when I could, sat quietly in the back, clapped when everyone else did. I watched my children grow from a distance, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to step closer. Affection felt awkward. Words felt insufficient, so I stayed practical. My children grew up in a different world. More opportunities, more choices. They asked questions I never dared to ask. What do you want? Why do you do this job? Are you happy? Those questions unsettled me. They challenged the life I had carefully built. Sometimes I answered with silence. One evening, one of my children told me about a dream, a risky one, something uncertain. I responded the only way I knew how, with caution. I warned them, explained reality, listed consequences. I thought I was protecting them. Later that night, I realized I might have been protecting myself instead. As the years passed, my children stopped sharing everything. They told their mother more than me, their friends more than both of us. I noticed, but I didn't know how to fix it. By then, silence was a habit, and habits are hard to break. There are words I never said enough. I'm proud of you. I understand. I'm scared too. I assumed they knew, but assumptions don't always reach the heart. Sometimes they only reach your regrets. Now, when I look back, I see my children more clearly than I saw them then. I see their attempts to connect, their patience with my distance, their quiet acceptance of who I was. That realization is both comforting and painful. Children grow quickly. One day, they need you for everything. The next, they don't need you at all. Or at least, that's how it feels. Time moved faster than I expected, and I kept telling myself there would be another chance to say what mattered. Then life did what it always does. It changed the rules. Work slowed down. My body did too. And suddenly, the future I had planned for looked very different. In the next part of my life, I would learn that strength fades. And when it does, you're left with who you really are. I didn't notice myself getting old. No one ever does. Aging doesn't arrive like a visitor. It sneaks in. Slow, polite, almost respectful. I remember the exact day, not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. They called me into a small room, spoke carefully, used gentle words. Restructuring, changes, not personal. I nodded. I understood the language, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. I walked out of that building for the last time without anyone noticing. After decades of being needed, I became optional. People talk about retirement as if it's rest. But losing work before you're ready feels different. I still had energy, still had habits, but nowhere to put them. Mornings became quiet, too quiet. I woke up early anyway, muscle memory. Sat at the table with nothing scheduled. That was when it hit me. I had built my entire identity around being useful, and suddenly I wasn't. Friends from work stopped calling, not out of cruelty, just distance. Their lives continued. Mine paused. I didn't blame them. I just hadn't prepared myself for how invisible I would feel. Being unnecessary is a strange kind of grief. Not long after, my body began to change. Small things at first, pain that lingered, fatigue that didn't leave. Doctor visits became routine. They spoke calmly, professionally, manageable, chronic, monitor it. Words that sound gentle until they become permanent. I realized then, my body was aging faster than my mind. As strength faded, something else happened. I had to ask for help. From my wife, from my children. That was harder than any physical pain. I had spent a lifetime providing, solving, holding things together. Now I was the one being handled carefully. I noticed it in their faces. Concern, patience, and sometimes pity. They didn't mean to show it, but I saw it. The moment your children stop seeing you as strong is a quiet heartbreak. No one warns you about that. Old age isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with tragedy every day. Most days, it's just repetition. The same chair, the same window, the same thoughts. People assume loneliness comes from being alone. That's not true. Loneliness comes from feeling unnecessary, unconsulted, unneeded. My children visited, not often, but regularly. They had lives, jobs, responsibilities, problems of their own. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't want to burden them, so I smiled, nodded, said I was fine. That lie became easier over time. At 70, you think differently about strength. Strength isn't lifting heavy things. It's accepting that you can't anymore. Strength isn't independence. It's dignity when dependence arrives. That lesson took me years to learn. I thought regret would be loud, angry, demanding. It wasn't. It came softly, in the middle of ordinary days, moments when I remembered things I didn't say. Time I postponed. Love I assumed was understood. Regret waits patiently. As my world grew smaller, one question kept returning. What was it all for? The work, the sacrifice, the silence. I didn't have an answer, not yet, but I felt something else beginning. Not despair, but reflection. Old age strips life down to what truly mattered. What remains is not achievements, it's moments. In the final part of my life, I began to understand something too late to change the past. But maybe in time to change how I speak about it. At 70, life becomes quiet in a different way. Not empty, just stripped down. I sit in the same chair every morning, near the window. The light comes in at an angle I've learned to recognize. Some days I don't even turn on the radio. Silence feels honest now. It doesn't rush me. It doesn't demand answers. It just sits with me. Outside, people hurry. Cars pass. Phones ring. Lives unfold quickly. Inside, my world moves slower. And for the first time, I'm not fighting that. I used to believe slowing down meant falling behind. Now I understand. Slowing down is how you finally notice what you missed. There's one memory that comes back more than the others. A young boy, standing near a water tap behind a school, pretending he wasn't hungry. I didn't know him back then. I do now. I want to tell him something. Not advice, not warnings. Just this. You survived. But you were allowed to want more. People ask me sometimes what life taught me. They expect wisdom, something neat, something comforting. But life isn't neat. Here's what I know now. Being strong isn't the same as being closed. Being responsible isn't the same as being fulfilled. And providing for others doesn't excuse withholding yourself from them. Recently, one of my children visited. We sat together quietly. At some point, they reached out and held my hand. No words, just presence. That moment mattered more than every hour I ever worked overtime. I wish I had known that earlier. Regret never fully leaves, but it changes. When you're younger, regret feels sharp. At my age, it's softer, heavier, but quieter. I don't try to fight it anymore. I let it sit beside me, like an old companion who has nothing new to say. For a long time, I blamed myself for what I didn't become, for what I didn't say, for the risks I avoided. Now I try to see myself with kinder eyes. I did the best I could with what I understood then. That doesn't erase the cost, but it allows me to breathe. In the end, life isn't measured by achievements. It's measured by moments. Who sat beside you? Who listened? Who felt safe with you? The quiet ones count too, especially the quiet ones. If you're listening to this and you're younger than I am, ask yourself something. Not someday, not later. Now, who are you trying to be useful for? What are you postponing because it feels risky? And who might need more of you? Not your work, not your effort, but your presence. Because time doesn't warn you when it's about to pass. I used to think life was about control, about holding things together. Now I know. Life is about letting go, carefully, honestly, without bitterness. About saying what you mean before silence says it for you. This isn't advice. It's just a record of one ordinary life. Not wasted, not perfect, just lived. If there's anything worth carrying forward, it's this. Don't wait until the room gets quiet to listen to yourself.